Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that the meetings we have held have traditionally been useful to you, as you understand. Not how geo develops. Political struggle around another threat invented with the West to suppress the Russian Federation. I mean the establishment of a Nazi regime in Kiev through a coup d'etat to develop Ukrainian territory, to create a direct threat to the military security of our country, and to destroy the culture of the Russian Federation. Donbass territory, New Russia. For centuries, the ancestors of those who now live there, who want to be faithful to their history and language, who want to raise their children in traditions that, I repeat, have been created and passed down from generation to generation in their families for centuries. We put the geopolitical aspects of the Ukraine crisis in the headline of today's event. You already know the roots go far in modern history, in the period before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in the years after. Today, many historians, responsible political scientists, and experts in the West are talking about what is the first thing. Their colleagues have been talking for years, maybe even decades, when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved when the Soviet Union opened to the United States to unite the West with Europe. On the whole, on the basis of equality, mutual benefit, and mutual respect. No one has dissolved NATO, and in general, he will not dissolve NATO. Many people think it's a mistake. Just yesterday, Jeffrey Sachs, a well-known American economist and political scientist, recalled that historic mistake again in an interview with Tucker Carlson. In his view, there is no subjunctive tendency in NATO history. And obviously there's a reason, according to which NATO did not respond to the Warsaw Pact in return. It did not dissolve itself, nor did it propose that the former socialist camp countries leave only the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, do not have any closed military blocs, and continue to live in a new open way from now on. On the basis of mutual respect and seeking mutual benefit, this has not been done. But now we can say with certainty that the reason for this decision, the United States has an unwavering desire to maintain NATO as a tool for controlling Europe, including over Germany, where there are still dozens of US military bases, in order to make the Germans obey Washington's orders. When a major pipeline called Nord Stream was blown up to eliminate a competitor in the European energy market, the Germans were silent. They swallowed it silently, prepared to pay 1.5 times the price of American liquefied natural gas, and paid 2 times the price of Russian gas supplied through pipelines. This is to keep Europe subordinate to the United States, and NATO is needed. That's why. At the moment of the dissolution of NATO's Warsaw Pact, no one dissolved it. On the contrary, they began to use it to strengthen American hegemonism on this continent and now on other continents. Did you hear what Stoltenberg said recently when asked if NATO was a defensive alliance? Are you defending the territory of your member states and doing nothing else? He said, yes, that's right, but the threat to the territory of our member states. It comes from different corners of the world, including the Indo-Pacific region, so NATO will expand its infrastructure and build alliances. In this region of the Asia-Pacific region, they call it the Indo-Pacific. Stoltenberg said that for well-known reasons, and in this sense, Euro-Atlantic security and Asia-Pacific security, inseparable? So many countries. There, our common continent is starting to prepare for NATO's efforts to ensure our security with you. But back to the period of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in addition to what has been achieved. Many of our experts believe that the arms control agreement is not completely fair, and it contains unilateral concessions from the Soviet Union. In addition to subsequent agreements, it also ensures the permanent presence of American observers in the field of arms control. The facility where our strategic nuclear weapons are produced. In addition to the fact that in those years, in the early 1990s, a large number of American and other Western experts worked in most government agencies in our country, a new Russian Federation had been announced. Or is that why the Soviet Union disappeared? America's most important competitor, America's competitor and their in the world order, the country led by the socialist camp, together with the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, promoted the principle of respecting the Charter of the United Nations. And then he disappeared. And remember, economist, politician, scientist Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history from now on and forever, he said. The liberal world order will dominate, and we do not expect any opposition from anyone. Well, that just means that they decided that the new Russia, like all the former Soviet republics, like all the former Warsaw Pact members, is now in their pockets. This is obvious to the United States and the collective West. Opinion that prevailed there and that dominated. For a long time, and even now, they are still driving all the events that you and I are watching. Happens. By no means does the United States want to lead the collective West. It is becoming more and more difficult to do so without losing its hegemony on the international stage. Everything is harder, if not impossible, when powerful economic giants rise, mainly in Eurasia, but also in Africa and Latin America. And here it is. Fighting for hegemony and maintaining hegemony by means of military threats, blackmail and sanctions is a struggle for the coming era. It is not clear that in this struggle what we see as the West is grabbing everything. These are their illegal methods. In general, the pain of the world order that Navi entered the United States began. They still say that they impose on everyone else not international law, based on the Charter of the United Nations, in all its entirety and in all its interrelationships, but a rules-based order. We have discussed this topic when a coup d'etat was necessary, And when democracy prevailed in a country when they came to power,
Заявляется, что демократия возобладала в какой-то стране, когда к власти приходят где-то в Африке.
for example, somewhere in Africa, revolutionary forces are coming to power, eager to get rid of the last shackles of neo-colonialism, then it's called unconstitutional. Sanctions are being imposed, but there are many other things. Back to the beginning of what is happening in Europe and the world as a whole.
Которые сейчас обусловили происходящее в Европе, да и в целом в мире. Так вот, Запад решил, что
So the West decided that he had something in Russia. So when 2000,
после первого избрания
well, with the election of Vladimir Putin as president, Russia began to regain its dignity.
возвращать свое достоинство, свои
And her right to her rightful place on the international stage. At first, the United States did not take it seriously, but it thought it was.
Поначалу Соединенные Штаты это всерьез не восприняли. Но они думали, что это так какие-то отдельные проявления
What are the individual manifestations?
национального характера.
National, especially in Russia in 2000.
В нулевые годы Россия, выступая за
Advocate respect for one's own rights.
собственных прав, отстаивала эти права на
He defended these rights in the international arena only through the proposal of equal agreement cooperation and many examples.
договоренностей, и примеров тому множество. Ведь мы создали
After all, we have established a broad system of interaction with the European Union.
там десятки механизмов.
There are dozens of mechanisms in the form of structures met many times throughout the year, worked out a roadmap, and agreed to create 4 common spaces throughout the Eurasian continent. There are many creative, progressive, and promising ideas with the same NATO.
Пространств на всем евразийском континенте. Там было очень много созидательных, прогрессивных, перспективных идей. С тем же НАТО, вопреки
Contrary to,
нарушению Западом своего
the West violated its own.
и обязательства данного еще
The Soviet leader, and then the first leader of the Russian Federation, made promises and obligations not to expand NATO eastward.
это расширение, как вы знаете, состоялось.
As you know, this expansion happened, but even then, even in the late 1990s,
Министр иностранных дел Евгений Примаков
Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov,
на переговорах с Североатлантическим
in negotiations, the North Atlantic Alliance still shows its willingness not to pose and not to start aggressively opposing violations that violate the honest words of our Western partners. What remains to be said is that compromise has been agreed upon, and the West has assumed these obligations, that is, on the territory of the new members, that is, we seem to accept the fact that there are already new members.
условлено, и Запад взял на себя эти обязательства, что на территории новых членов, то есть мы как бы смирились с тем, что есть уже новые члены, не будут размещаться существенные боевые.
There will be no significant combat troops.
Это все было закреплено в рамках Совета России и НАТО.
All of this is fixed within the framework of the NATO-Russia Council, which has also worked in many areas and has established an anti-terrorism team to assist Afghanistan, etc. Of course, all of this is now ruined.
Развалено Западом по его одностороннему решению.
With the West in its unilateral decision, but
Компромисс на территории новых членов.
we will not compromise on the territory of the new members, nor will we deploy a permanent large combat force. After that, we began to notice that there was such a placement.
Такое размещение. Запад нам стал говорить, это несущественные силы. И не
The West began to tell us these insignificant and fickle forces.
там одна бригада вот направляет,
If we have a brigade there, it's on a rotational basis.
а потом эта бригада уезжает, и тут же приезжает вторая бригада.
Then this brigade leaves, and immediately 2 brigades come. So all this rotation becomes permanent. We suggest that we agree on what the term means. Major combat forces have submitted specific proposals, including figures for heavy weapons and small arms, and the number of military personnel that will fall under this definition, and flatly refuse to even discuss them.
Определение. Категорически отказались даже обсуждать. И По мере того, как
As we have shown goodwill again and again, they have offered to lay a solid foundation for our interaction with NATO. But they have not agreed to anything that in some way limits their freedom of action,
что хоть как-то ограничивало свободу их действий, в том числе в ущерб нашим интересам. По мере этого мы
including harming our interests. As we went on, we generally began to understand
тщетность дальнейших отношений.
not only is it futile to further develop relations with these countries and their leaders, but it is necessary to send our signal as clearly as possible, as President Putin did at the Munich conference in 2007, when he opened.
В 2007 году, когда он откровенно, но, естественно, вежливо привлек внимание
Yes, but naturally polite.
лидеров,
It drew the attention of Western leaders present to the fact that they could not dictate their will.
диктовать свою волю.
We are all, and the world is much more diverse than Western civilization, especially since Western civilization has begun to degenerate greatly in the context of the ideas that are now being promoted in Europe and the United States.
Идей, которые сейчас продвигаются в Европе, в Соединенных Штатах, в других странах коллективного Запада. Это предупреждение.
In other countries of the collective West, this warning was issued at the Munich conference.
Ну, по большому счету тоже не было воспринято всем.
Well, in general, it's not taken seriously either.
Улыбались, решили, что просто вот
They smiled and thought Russia was just expressing its dissatisfaction in this way.
и дальнейшие наши контакты с западными коллегами
And our further contacts with our Western colleagues, during which time we have completely,
конкретно
Ratio.
пагубность того курса.
they specifically explain the dangers of the course taken by the West, believing that Russia can now be ignored. All of our explanations have also been lost.
Но мы, отмечу,
But we will point out that we have not lost.
все-таки
We have not lost the desire to overcome this confrontation, which is accumulating and becoming more and more threatening. In 2008, we proposed the conclusion of a European security treaty.
мы предложили
The point was simple.
договор о европейской безопасности. Суть его была простая. За несколько лет до этого в рамках ОБСЕ все
A few years ago, everything was in the framework of
на
OBNE.
высшем уровне, на саммите,
The countries of the organization are at the top of the summit.
где было сказано, ни одна
They signed the principle of indivisibility of security, which says no country.
пространстве ОБСЕ не будет укреплять
No organization in the OSCE space will strengthen its own security at the expense of the security of others.
на пространстве ОБСЕ, не будет
And no organization
на то, чтобы доминировать.
in space B and E will not claim to dominate this geopolitical territory.
НАТО делало ровно наоборот. Продолжала втягивать в себя все новое.
NATO has done the opposite, continuing to attract more and more new members.
Обратив свой жадный взор и на страны бывшего Союза.
Turning his greedy eyes to the former Soviet Union, well, in addition to the Baltic states, he found himself there earlier.
Мы предложили, спросили у нас.
We made suggestions and asked NATO members. Well, there is a political commitment not to not dominate, but you try to dominate, strengthen your security to the detriment of us.
Как будем выполнять? Они ответили нам, вы знаете, это политическая декларация.
How are we going to implement it? They answered us, it's a political declaration. We say, well, a political declaration signed by the presidents and prime ministers.
Не несет никаких.
Yes, but this is a political declaration. It does not have any legal consequences.
Получить только
And legal security guarantees can only be obtained in NATO.
хорошо. И положили на стол в 2008 году проект договора.
They said it well and put it on the table. 2008 draft European Security Treaty,
Записано в декларации саммита,
where everything is the same as recorded.
было кодифицировано.
In the declaration of the summit on B&E was codified.
Юридических обязательств.
It already contains a legal obligation clause about what we are talking to you about. This was flatly rejected.
Гарантии юридического плана могут предоставляться только.
The guarantees of the legal plan can
Хорошо, тогда мы в 2010
only for NATO members. Well, then we're in 2010.
заключить договор не в рамках ОБСЕ, а Россия, НАТО.
They proposed that the treaty be concluded not within the framework of the OCE, but within the framework of NATO-Russia. They refused too.
Наталкивало.
Our goodwill has repeatedly encountered this behavior.
Когда в начале
When George W. Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty in the early 2000s, President Putin warned him that this reckless move, he said, "This is not against you. We will build this missile defense, but we will build this missile defense against the Islamic Republic of Iran." Of course, he was deceived. Now everyone knows that the missile defense configuration of the United States and its allies is purely to contain Russia and the People's Republic of China. But in 2002, Shistao 1010, when we were still trying to convince the Americans and other NATO members that we needed to be more cautious about our actions in Europe and the international arena as a whole, we proposed a joint missile defense system between Russia and Europe. They didn't answer us anything understandable, and then they put everything on the brakes. They didn't want to interact with us. They didn't want to cooperate with us. A similar situation occurred with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2020. The Americans withdrew from the treaty, accusing us of violating the treaty and deploying land-based missiles in the Kaliningrad region. They left any contact and only took the step unilaterally. The Russian president said at the time, "We regret it because it is very a destabilizing weapon." He suggested that Russia declare a moratorium, although the treaty ceased to exist due to the withdrawal of the United States. Russia will abide by its provisions, thus declaring a unilateral moratorium, and we will abide by this moratorium until then. So far, these US-made land-based missiles will not appear anywhere else in the world. Now it's happening in the Philippines. Denmark has deployed such missiles. We made a statement to them that we warned you a few years ago, but when was it? This did not happen in 2020, trying to somehow save the situation and prevent the spread of this new destabilizing weapon on the planet. President Putin took the initiative to send a letter to NATO countries expounding our position, including unilateral suspension, and calling on NATO members to join our suspension group in the absence of a treaty. Declare its unilateral moratorium. In addition, he wrote, he was ready to send a message because you suspected that we were in the Kaliningrad region. Iskander systems, the corresponding missiles have been deployed, and the departing people are prohibited from doing so. By contract, we invite you to come and make sure that's not the case. In turn, we want to come to Poland and Romania, where the Mk-41 anti-missile system is located at the base of the 3rd Missile Defense Position Area, and these systems are as advertised. These systems, published on the websites of the manufacturers of these weapons, can be used not only as a means of missile defense, but also as launches for short and medium-range missiles previously prohibited by the treaty. That is fair. Come to us and we'll come to you. Let's make sure, then let's just abide by the moratorium without any agreement. They flatly refused, which alone shows that they played dishonestly. Originally, the Americans withdrew from the treaty in order to develop new space. Including here. The Philippines and I believe other countries in the Asia-Pacific region will also
предоставить гостеприимную территорию для...
The test will receive requests to provide hospitable territory for similar weapons, and our goodwill has not dried up. When in January 2020,
В 2020 году, в январе, президент Путин был приглашен премьером Нетаньяху в Иерусалим на открытие...
President Putin was invited by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Jerusalem to open a memorial to the victims of the Leningrad blockade.
Президент выразил озабоченность накоплением...
In that speech, the president expressed concern about the accumulation of tensions in international relations and called for the permanent members of the UN Security Council should show their responsibilities and get ready for the summit. Everything to discuss. But what if these claims are against each other? Honestly, how do we feel? What problems do each of us see in international relations during that period, and how do we propose to overcome them?
Французы поддержали, Китайская Народная Республика первая поддержала, США молчали.
The French supported the People's Republic of China One, supported with Esh-A, and remained silent. The British naturally looked at the old comrade. As a result, all of this slipped on the brakes in some way, but the most extreme attempt was made. In full swing, the Kiev regime launched a war in Donbass in violation of the Minsk agreements and directly stated that it would not implement the Minsk agreements. Although they were approved by the United Nations Security Council. Now, by the way, this is an example of the Kiev regime, which has said it will not implement this security resolution. This example has become contagious in the United States, when they passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan a few months ago. The permanent representative of the United States, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, abstained from exercising her veto. But when the resolution was adopted, she stated that it was not binding. So there was a direct parallel between the Minsk agreement and the position of the United States on the Security Council decision. But still, at the President's initiative, in early December 2021, attention was drawn to the situation. The most serious thing is that it is necessary to stop the actions taken by the Ukrainian regime in violation of the Minsk agreements. We proposed 2 treaties, and in December, we distributed these treaties to 21 leading states and 1 with NATO countries. How to ensure European security while fully taking into account the legitimate interests of all participants, including Ukraine, Russia, and European countries. We were told that the main meaning of this is that Ukraine should not become a member of any military bloc. We were told it wasn't your business. And they refused to discuss the proposal alone, but the move comes after months of sounding the alarm. The CIA director and other envoys came to us to call for a solution that did not involve the use of force, despite the increasing use of force by the Ukrainian regime throughout all these persuasions. When the West rejected our 22-year proposal, in December, 21-year proposal, and Ukraine still rejected the Minsk agreement in January and February. Announced the start of Plan B. Repeatedly increased the intensity of the bombing of Donbass. We had no choice but to declare a special military operation. The president talked about it in great detail. And speaking of geopolitics, how did all this develop and how did it develop? We were told that in 21 years, Ukraine and NATO decided for themselves how to establish their relations. So don't always even mess around like this. 8 years ago, the EU replied to us in 2013.
В 2013 году президент Украины Янукович в ходе переговоров о соглашении об ассоциации с Европейским Союзом
Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych drew attention to the following points during negotiations on an association agreement with the European Union.
обязательствами Украины в рамках другого соглашения
Can this agreement be concluded?
о зоне свободной торговли.
Contrary to Ukraine's obligations under another agreement, the CIS Free Trade Area Agreement, in which tariffs on almost all goods do not exist, is our relationship with the European Union, especially with other countries in the post-Soviet region. Tariffs affect certain types of products, and they are quite serious.
А поскольку Украина на переговорах с Евросоюзом, Евросоюз очень хотел
And because of Ukraine,
все тарифы на экспорт,
in negotiations with the European Union really wanted to zero all tariffs on its exports to Ukraine, but there was a conflict
открытую, широкую
that threatens to turn Ukraine into a mere
ненужного нам экспорта вопреки соглашениям России и Евросоюза. И мы тогда
open a wide road, we don't need an export.
в декабре 21
Contrary to the agreement, Russia, the European Union, and we then proposed the same as we proposed the North Atlantic Alliance on December 21st. Let's sit down and have a look.
Евросоюза в 2013 году. Давайте
How to ensure that no one is violated, we then proposed to the EU in 2013.
действующие для Украины
Let's sit down and see how we can harmonize the existing free trade area agreement for Ukraine with the future and future association agreement between the EU and Ukraine.
нам сказали, кстати, это был Жозе Мануэль Баррозу, глава Еврокомиссии.
By the way, we were told that this is Jose Manuel Barroso, the president of the European Commission, not to get involved in our affairs with Ukraine, and we are not involved in your trade relations, such as with Canada. Well, in general, it's announced. Those who once again confirmed that he was a man of little intellect.
Когда Янукович все-таки понял,
But the rejection played a fatal role, because Yanukovych still realized that he needed more time to figure out what to do with the association agreement.
поднял волну протестов, и они на постоянной основе
The European Union raised
Украины стартовал так
a
называемый
wave of protests. They sat in Ukraine's main square all the time. The so-called Independence Square began. And then we ended the coup.
и
In
нынешняя
short,
геополитическая линия Запада, она
such a geopolitical background, and
от тех его подходов, когда
the current geopolitical line of the West is no different from its approach. When it is driven by it, the only desire is to prevent Russia from becoming stronger and to prevent Russia from occupying its own territory.
место на международной арене окружить Россию поясом недружественных государств.
Their rightful place on the international stage is to surround Russia with a belt of unfriendly countries. This happened in 2008 when they taught then Georgian President Saakashvili to attack Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia. This is happening to some extent now that they are still trying.
Сейчас, когда они все-таки пытаются, не все-таки, а просто пытаются полностью забрать себе Молдову, посадив там
However, they are just trying to take Moldova completely, imprisoning leaders there who are in the interests of the West, not their own people. Well, there are many other examples of how they act. We recently met with President Putin as part of my delegation to Uzbekistan. We have regular contacts with our Kazakh friends, with all Central Asian countries.
казахскими друзьями, со всеми странами Центральной Азии, и мы видим, как Запад на Центральную Азию хочет распространить свое влияние.
We see how the West wants to extend its influence to Central Asia.
Изолировать Россию, она и не дать ей
So the task,
не дать ей
she isolated Russia and prevented it from developing. In general, to realize your full potential.
но качество нынешних политиков на Западе
It is certainly illusory and utopian,
позволяет
but the quality of current Western politicians is enough to allow them to.
могут всерьез делать иллюзии и утопии своей практической программой.
They can be serious,
Как говорится,
make illusions,
пусть стараются.
and the utopia of his practical plan, well, as they say,
Провалом, по-моему, ни у кого сомнений не вызывает. Но
Let them try. In my opinion, no one doubts that this will end in failure.
распада Советского Союза,
But these are the goals that started after that.
что Россия-то оказывается непослушная, сопротивляется.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia realized that it was naughty.
Вот этот менталитет, он остается.
Ratio.
В конкретных изгибах
Our orders.
ситуации вокруг Украины.
This mentality, it still exists, and it manifests itself in specific curves. Oh, the situation around Ukraine is already with a quiet boot. It is said that it can be attacked anywhere in the Russian Federation. The president spoke very much about the topic yesterday before leaving Tashkent. I'm sure you're familiar with her statement, and I won't repeat it, but now I'd like to. As the French say, stop your exposé and give the floor to those who want to share their thoughts or ask questions. Thank you.